My name is Sarah Mitchell, I'm 32, and for years I believed being the dependable daughter would finally earn me a place at the table. I worked overtime, sent money I could barely spare, and kept the heat running in a house that wasn't even mine. But one December night, a call from my mother shattered that illusion. Imagine hearing you're not welcome at your own family's New Year's Eve dinner, because keeping the peace for someone else mattered more than honoring everything you'd done. What would you do in that moment? Keep swallowing the hurt, or finally make a choice they would never forget? Stay with me, because this is the night everything changed. Let me take you back to where it began. I was sitting in my small Livonia apartment on December 18, 2024, stirring a packet of instant ramen while flipping through an old magazine from the grocery store checkout. The Michigan winter air was already biting, seeping through every crack in my 30-year-old building. Outside, the gray sky looked heavy with snow. My phone rang. Mom. My stomach tightened the way it always did when I saw her name. I hit speaker and kept stirring my dinner. Sarah, honey, about New Year's Eve dinner this year. Her voice came through light and casual, like she was discussing groceries. We think it's better if you stayed home. You know how Jessica gets when there's tension around. We want a peaceful celebration to start the new year right. For a second, I thought I'd misheard. The plastic spoon stopped moving. I'm sorry, what she continued without missing a beat. To keep things peaceful. Jessica's been really stressed with her podcast launch, and family gatherings can be overwhelming for her right now. I set the ramen down. The bowl hit the table with a sharp sound. Jessica again. My 25-year-old sister who'd never held a real job, who'd blown through more of my parents' money than I'd made in years. The princess who never worried about rent or heat. So, I'm not invited to my own family's New Year's dinner because Jessica might get uncomfortable. I could hear Mom's familiar sigh, the one that meant, don't make this difficult. It's just one dinner, Sarah. You'll be fine on your own. You always are. I stood up the chair, scraping against linoleum. Just one dinner, I repeated slowly, feeling something cold settle in my chest. You say that after I've sent over $3,200 to keep your house heated this year alone. Silence stretched between us, just the faint static of the phone connection. Don't bring money into this, she finally said defensively. You offered to help. We didn't ask you to take over the heating bill. I let out a dry laugh that echoed in my empty apartment. Offered. In January, when the furnace broke and you called me crying at midnight, who paid the emergency repair? In March, when Dad's arthritis flared up from the cold, who set up the heating payment plan? In September, when Jessica spent her savings on podcast equipment, who covered the fall heating oil? She couldn't argue with facts. Instead, she went back to her tired line. Family is family, Sarah. Jessica really needs our support right now. I walked to my window and watched the first snowflakes starting to fall. I'd been through a lot too, but I was never the one who got protection. I was the one who provided it. Don't make this awkward. Her voice had that familiar edge of impatience. It's not personal. I gripped the windowsill. Then don't expect another dime from me this winter. If I'm not family enough for dinner, don't treat me like family when you need money. I hung up before she could respond. Outside, snow kept falling silently. I walked back to my kitchen table and opened my laptop. The screen lit up and I navigated to DTE Energy, the website I'd been visiting monthly for 4 years. I logged in as account holder for 1247 Elmwood Drive, my parents' address. The account I'd quietly taken over in 2020 when Dad lost his GM plant job and was too proud to handle online payments. I pulled up my Excel spreadsheet tracking every payment. 47 transactions over 4 years. $11,500 total, $3,200 just this year. Money earned working overtime at Midwest Logistics Hub while my back ached in the warehouse cold. I opened Jessica's Instagram in another tab. Mindful Jessim, full of photos showing $200 brunches and boutique wellness purchases. The same Jessica too, stressed to handle having her sister at dinner. My cursor hovered over account management. There it was, cancel service. I'd looked at this button during frustrating calls before but never had the courage to click it. There was always some voice reminding me that good daughters took care of parents, that I was the responsible one keeping everyone's world running. But sitting there eating 30-cent ramen while my sister posted about artisanal candles and my parents planned a peaceful new year without me, something shifted. I felt a smile spread across my face, but it wasn't happy. It was the cold, determined smile of someone who'd finally reached their limit. I clicked cancel service. The confirmation loaded immediately. Service termination effective December 19, 2024. Your final bill will be mailed to the address on file. I closed the laptop and sat back. Outside snow was falling heavier, now blanketing cars and sidewalks in white. Tomorrow morning my parents would wake up in a house already starting to get cold, and for the first time in 4 years it wouldn't be my problem to solve. I woke up the next morning with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. December 19th started like any other Thursday, except I wasn't dreading my phone buzzing with family emergencies that somehow always became my responsibility. I got to Midwest Logistics Hub 40 minutes early, something that had become routine. The warehouse was quiet in the pre-dawn hours, just the hum of loading dock lights and distant trucks warming up. I liked these moments before chaos started, when I could organize my thoughts for another day moving freight across the Great Lakes region. Carmen Rodriguez found me in the break room around 7:30 pouring coffee from the pot I'd made for the morning crew. Carmen had been my supervisor before getting promoted to floor manager, and she'd become something like a mentor. At 54, she had the steady confidence that comes from surviving a messy divorce and raising 2 kids on warehouse wages. "You look different today," she said, settling across from me with her mug. "Not tired like usual." I told her about the phone call, the New Year's Eve dinner I'd been uninvited to, the heating bill I'd finally stopped paying. Carmen listened without interrupting, nodding, as I explained the pattern that had been draining my account for 4 years. "My ex-husband's family pulled the same garbage," she said when I finished. "His mother would guilt me into paying for vacations I wasn't invited to. Took me 8 years to realize I was being used like a personal ATM. Hearing someone else say it made something loosen in my chest. I wasn't crazy. This wasn't normal family behavior." Mike Thompson wandered in for morning coffee and caught the tail end of our conversation. Mike operated forklift and had a reputation as one of our hardest workers. He was a single dad raising 2 kids after his ex-wife moved to Florida, picking up overtime shifts just like me. Mike shared his story about cutting off his financially abusive brother the year before. His brother had been borrowing money for emergencies that always turned out to be gambling debts, and Mike finally had to choose between enabling his brother or keeping a roof over his own kids' heads. "You did the right thing," he told me. "Family doesn't mean you set yourself on fire to keep other people warm." Around 9, our supervisor mentioned something that made my ears perk up. Corporate had been reviewing performance metrics, and there was talk of promoting someone to assistant operations manager after New Year's. The pay bump would be nearly $8,000 more per year, ironically, almost exactly what I'd been sending to my parents. During lunch break, I opened Jessica's social media accounts and really looked at them. Her Instagram was a showcase of expensive lifestyle choices. Artisanal coffee shops, boutique fitness classes, organic skincare that cost more than my weekly groceries. Her latest post showed her at some trendy Royal Oak restaurant, laughing over brunch that probably cost more than I made in a day. The caption read, "Grateful for this beautiful life and the family who supports my dreams." I scrolled through months of similar posts. Designer workout clothes, meditation retreats, professional photography equipment. All while my parents claimed they couldn't afford heating without my help. Then I found something that made my blood run cold. A GoFundMe campaign Jessica had created 8 months ago, titled, "Help Support My Elderly Parents Through Financial Hardship." She'd raised $1,200 from friends' money I'd never heard about. Money that supposedly went toward medical bills and repairs while I was covering utilities. The description painted Jessica as the devoted daughter sacrificing her dreams to care for aging parents. No mention of her podcast equipment Chicago trips, or the fact that her older sister had been covering heating bills for years without recognition. I forwarded the link to Carmen, who shook her head. That's fraud, honey. Plain and simple. As my shift ended, I volunteered for New Year's Eve overtime. Double time and a half for holiday work, and I'd rather be useful at the warehouse than sitting alone wondering what my family was saying about me. My phone had been buzzing all day on silent. When I finally checked it in the parking lot, there were 3 missed calls and a text from Dad. Furnace seems off today. Mind checking it for us? I stared at the message, then turned my phone face down on the passenger seat. I drove home through the December evening past houses with Christmas lights and families visible through warm, bright windows. For the first time in years, I wasn't rushing home to solve someone else's crisis. I was just going home to take care of myself. The next 3 days passed in a strange kind of peace. December 20th through 22nd felt like the first time in years I'd been able to breathe without waiting for the other shoe to drop. No emergency calls about broken appliances, no panic texts about overdue bills, no guilt trips disguised as family updates. My phone kept buzzing, but I'd learned to ignore it. The messages were predictable anyway. Dad asking about the furnace. Mom wondering if I was okay since I hadn't called back. Jessica sending passive-aggressive texts about how cold the house was getting, as if I was supposed to feel guilty about their discomfort. At work, my supervisor pulled me aside during the Tuesday morning briefing. "Corporate's been asking about you," she said with a smile. "That assistant operations manager position I mentioned. They want to fast-track the interview process. Could be yours by January 15th if you're interested." I told her I was definitely interested. The timing felt like the universe rewarding me for finally standing up for myself. 8,000 more per year would mean I could actually start saving money instead of living paycheck to paycheck while subsidizing my family's lifestyle. Around noon, I got a call from my neighbor Eleanor Nakamura. Eleanor was 67, a retired elementary school teacher who lived in the duplex next to my parents' house. She'd always been kind to me, remembering my birthday, and asking about my job whenever we ran into each other at the grocery store. "Sarah, honey, I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from your mother." She sounded worried, her voice careful and gentle. "I noticed your parents bundling up more than usual lately, and your mom mentioned something about the furnace acting up. I offered to let them borrow my space heater, but they seemed upset about something else. Family troubles, maybe?" I could picture Eleanor standing in her kitchen, genuinely concerned about her neighbors, but not wanting to pry. She'd probably spent hours debating whether to call me the kind of person who brought casseroles to new families and organized neighborhood watch meetings. "The furnace isn't acting up," I told her honestly. "I stopped paying their heating bill because they uninvited me from New Year's Eve dinner. They wanted a peaceful family celebration without me, so now they can have a peaceful winter without my financial help too." There was a long pause. "Oh my," she said softly. "I had no idea you'd been helping with their utilities. Your mother made it sound like you were being difficult about some family disagreement." That afternoon, Eleanor called back. "I hope this doesn't sound inappropriate, but I saw the DTE energy truck at their house earlier. The technician was asking about service disconnection procedures. Your parents told me they'd been having issues with automatic payments, but now I'm wondering if there's more to the story." I appreciated Eleanor's tactful way of saying she was starting to see through my parents' version of events. She was the kind of neighbor who noticed when someone's newspaper piled up, or when cars sat in driveways too long, always looking out for the elderly folks on her street. Meanwhile, Jessica's relationship with Tyler was getting rocky. Tyler Brooks worked in marketing at some downtown Detroit firm, the kind of guy who wore expensive jeans and talked about craft beer like it was a personality trait. He'd been dating Jessica for about 8 months, long enough to start asking uncomfortable questions about her financial situation. From what I'd gathered through social media and the neighborhood gossip chain, Tyler had started wondering why Jessica's parents couldn't afford heating while she was posting Instagram stories from expensive restaurants. Jessica's usual deflection tactics weren't working anymore. She'd been telling people I was having some kind of breakdown, being cruel and unreasonable, But Tyler was smart enough to notice the inconsistencies. Uncle David called me Wednesday evening. David was my dad's younger brother, 45 years old, and successful in auto parts sales. He'd always been the family member who spoke his mind, sometimes to a fault. "What the hell is wrong with you, Sarah?" His voice was sharp with anger. "Your parents are sitting in a house that's getting colder by the day, and you're playing some kind of power game over hurt feelings." I let him vent for about 30 seconds before I interrupted. "David, how much do you think I've sent them for utilities over the past 4 years?" He paused, clearly, not expecting the question. "I don't know. A few $100s here and there when things were tight." $11,500, I said calmly. "That's what I've paid in heating bills alone, while Jessica spent their retirement savings on failed business ventures and expensive lifestyle choices. I was uninvited from New Year's dinner because my presence might stress out the same sister who's been bleeding them dry for years." The silence on his end stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, quieter, less certain. "I didn't know it was that much money, Sarah." I sent him screenshots of my bank statements, the Excel spreadsheet tracking every payment, even Jessica's GoFundMe campaign that none of the family knew about. David was a numbers guy, and numbers didn't lie the way family narratives did. By Thursday evening, I'd made a decision about my legal situation. I'd been worried about the utility contract being in my name, wondering if I could be held responsible for leaving them without heat. I scheduled an appointment with Legal Aid of Western Michigan for December 27th, giving myself time to get through Christmas before dealing with potential legal complications. My phone showed 43 unread text messages and 16 missed calls by the time I went to bed on December 22nd. I turned it off completely for the first time in years, plugging it into the charger in my kitchen, where I couldn't hear it buzzing from my bedroom. Outside my apartment window, the snow was getting heavier. The weather forecast called for a major storm system moving through Michigan over the weekend, with temperatures dropping into the single digits. I made myself a cup of tea and settled into my warm living room, watching the snowflakes swirl under the streetlights. Somewhere across town, my parents were probably piling every blanket they owned onto their bed, finally understanding what it felt like when the person who'd been keeping them comfortable decided to stop. Christmas weekend arrived with the kind of bitter cold that makes your lungs ache when you step outside. I volunteered to work December 23rd through 25th at Midwest Logistics, knowing that holiday emergency shipments paid triple overtime and that I'd rather be useful than sitting alone in my apartment thinking about the family. Dinner I wasn't invited to. The warehouse felt different during the holidays. Quieter, with just a skeleton crew handling the urgent freight that couldn't wait until after Christmas. There was something peaceful about the rhythm of sorting packages and updating shipping manifests while most of the world was focused on family gatherings and gift exchanges. Carmen came in on Christmas Eve to check on operations and found me organizing a shipment of medical supplies bound for a hospital in Grand Rapids. "You don't have to prove anything by being here," she told me. But I could tell she understood why I needed to stay busy. "I'm not trying to prove anything," I replied, scanning another barcode. "I just feel more useful here than I would sitting at home wondering what they're saying about me over Christmas dinner." She nodded and helped me load the truck. Carmen had worked plenty of holidays during her own family struggles, and she knew that sometimes physical work was the best therapy for emotional pain. Meanwhile, Jessica was having her own Christmas crisis. Tyler's family had invited her to their holiday dinner in Bloomfield Hills, and she'd made the mistake of complaining about her parents' heating situation while surrounded by people who had enough money to actually help if the situation was legitimate. Tyler's mother had apparently asked pointed questions about why Jessica couldn't contribute to her elderly parents' utility bills, especially since Jessica had been posting photos of expensive purchases all month. According to the neighborhood gossip that eventually reached Eleanor, Jessica had broken down crying and admitted she'd been spending money on her lifestyle instead of helping with family emergencies. Tyler's family had suggested she get a job to help her parents, which sent Jessica into a defensive rage about how they didn't understand the pressures of being an entrepreneur and content creator. She'd stormed out of their Christmas dinner, effectively ending her relationship with the only person who'd been financially supporting her social media lifestyle. Back at my parents' house, Christmas Day was a study in stubborn pride meeting harsh reality. The temperature had dropped to 45 degrees inside, cold enough that their breath was visible when they talked. Dad refused to ask Eleanor for help with her space heater offer, and Mom was too embarrassed to admit to the neighbors that their adult daughter had been paying their heating bills for years. They'd attempted to cook Christmas dinner wearing winter coats, but Mom's hands had gotten too numb to properly handle the cooking utensils. They ended up eating cold sandwiches and canned soup, surrounded by every blanket and comforter they could find in the house. Eleanor told me later that she'd knocked on their door Christmas afternoon with a plate of homemade cookies, genuinely concerned about their well-being. She'd found them huddled together on the living room sofa, looking like refugees in their own home. "Your parents seem to be struggling more than they're letting on," Eleanor said when she called me that evening. "I offered to let them use my guest room until their heating situation gets resolved, but your father said they'd rather work things out as a family." The irony wasn't lost on me. They wanted to work things out as a family while excluding me from family gatherings. On Christmas night, the Livonia community Facebook group exploded with drama. Mom had posted a carefully worded message about how difficult the holidays were when adult children abandon their elderly parents over minor family disagreements. She'd crafted it to sound like I'd cut off contact over some petty argument, not mentioning the years of financial support or the fact that they'd uninvited me from New Year's dinner. But Eleanor had witnessed enough of the situation to know there was more to the story. She'd commented with a gentle but pointed response about how sometimes there are underlying issues that neighbors don't see, and that she'd noticed utility company trucks at their house recently. Other neighbors started sharing their own stories in the comments. Mrs. Patterson from 3 houses down mentioned how I'd helped her set up online banking the previous winter when she was recovering from hip surgery. Tom Rodriguez, who lived across the street, talked about how I'd volunteered to shovel his driveway after his heart attack without being asked and without accepting payment. The narrative was shifting slowly but noticeably. People who'd known me for years were starting to question why a daughter who'd always been helpful and responsible would suddenly abandon her parents without good reason. I spent Christmas night in my warm apartment eating leftover Chinese takeout and watching old movies on my laptop. I'd posted a single photo on Instagram that morning, myself, in comfortable pajamas holding a mug of hot cocoa by my small Christmas tree, with the caption "Grateful for peace, warmth, and boundaries. Merry Christmas to everyone who chooses kindness over chaos." Jessica saw the post within an hour and left a comment that she deleted 20 minutes later, but not before several people had screenshot it. Something about how some people care more about their comfort than their family's suffering. The backlash from people who'd been following the community Facebook drama was swift and harsh. As I prepared for bed on December 25th, I felt something I hadn't experienced during the holidays in years. Contentment. Not happiness exactly, but a deep sense of peace that came from finally prioritizing my own well-being over other people's expectations. My phone had been buzzing with messages all day, but I'd kept it in the kitchen drawer, checking it only once every few hours. 47 new texts, 12 missed calls, and 3 voicemails I hadn't listened to. The desperate edge to their attempts at contact told me everything I needed to know about how their Christmas had gone without my financial safety net keeping them comfortable. The week after Christmas brought a different kind of cold. Not just the Michigan winter that settled into your bones, but the cold reality of watching relationships crumble under the weight of truth. December 26th through 28th felt like watching dominoes fall in slow motion. Tyler had apparently spent Christmas night thinking about Jessica's meltdown at his family's dinner, and by December 26th, he was asking questions she couldn't answer. According to Eleanor, who seemed to have her finger on the pulse of every neighborhood drama, Tyler had shown up at Jessica's apartment, demanding to know why she was spending money on expensive skincare routines while her elderly parents were freezing. Jessica's first instinct was to blame me, painting me as the cruel older sister who'd abandoned the family over petty grudges. But Tyler wasn't stupid. He'd seen her Instagram posts, her GoFundMe campaigns, and her casual attitude towards spending money she claimed not to have. The breaking point came when Tyler discovered Jessica had been creating content for an adult website under a different name, earning about $800 a month that she'd never mentioned. Money that could have helped with her parents' heating bills but instead went toward maintaining her lifestyle while she played the victim on social media. He ended their relationship that same day, telling her she was toxic and manipulative. Jessica lost not just her boyfriend, but also her primary source of financial support, since Tyler had been covering most of their restaurant bills and entertainment expenses. On December 27th, I kept my appointment with Patricia Williams at Legal Aid of Western Michigan. Patricia was a no-nonsense attorney in her mid-40s who specialized in family financial disputes and elder law. Her office was in a converted house in downtown Grand Rapids, the kind of place that helped working-class people navigate legal problems they couldn't afford to solve with expensive lawyers. I brought my laptop, my Excel spreadsheet, and 4 years' worth of bank statements showing every payment I'd made to DTE Energy on my parents' behalf. Patricia reviewed everything with the thoroughness of someone who'd seen too many families destroy themselves over money. You have no legal obligation to maintain utility service for a property you don't own, she told me after reviewing the contract. The fact that the account was set up in your name was a convenience arrangement, not a legal responsibility. Your parents are competent adults who can manage their own utilities. She explained that even if my parents tried to claim I'd abandoned them, Michigan law doesn't require adult children to provide financial support for their parents unless they're legally declared incompetent. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I didn't even realize I'd been carrying. Patricia also mentioned that my phone had a built-in recording feature for calls, something I discovered accidentally months earlier during a particularly manipulative conversation with Mom. Michigan was a one-party consent state, meaning I could legally record phone calls without telling the other person as long as I was part of the conversation. Keep documenting everything, she advised. People who financially abuse family members often escalate their behavior when their source of money disappears. That same afternoon, I met with James Park, a financial advisor who worked with Midwest logistics employees through their benefits program. James was a soft-spoken man in his late 30s who specialized in helping working-class families build wealth despite modest incomes. He reviewed my financial situation with the same clinical attention Patricia had given my legal documents. $11,500 over 4 years was money that could have transformed my life if I'd invested it properly. Instead, I was 32 years old, with less than $1,000 in savings and no retirement fund. We set up automatic transfers to start January 1st. $300 a month into a high-yield savings account, another $100 into a Roth IRA. It felt revolutionary to plan for my own future instead of subsidizing someone else's present. Meanwhile, Uncle David was conducting his own investigation into the family finances. As someone who worked in auto parts sales, he understood profit margins and cash flow better than most people. The numbers didn't add up when he really looked at them. David discovered that my parents had been carrying $18,500 in credit card debt from Jessica's various business ventures over the past 3 years. They'd been making minimum payments religiously, never missing a due date, while claiming they couldn't afford basic utilities without my help. The heating bill crisis wasn't about poverty. It was about priorities. They'd chosen to protect Jessica's credit score and enable her lifestyle while using me as their personal heating bill service. When David confronted Dad about the credit card debt, he got the same defensive responses I'd been hearing for years. Family helps family, David. Jessica needs our support right now. She's been through a lot, but David wasn't as easy to manipulate as I'd been. He demanded to see bank statements, credit card bills, and Jessica's actual business records. What he found was a pattern of financial irresponsibility disguised as family loyalty. On December 28th, while I was organizing my documents for the new year, I found something that stopped me cold. A letter from Grandpa Mitchell's estate attorney dated 3 years ago that had somehow gotten mixed in with my old tax paperwork. The letter was about Grandpa's tool collection, the beautiful set of wrenches and gauges and measuring instruments he'd collected over 40 years of working as a machinist at Ford. According to the will, the tools were supposed to come to me, the grandchild who'd spent summers in his garage, learning to fix things and appreciate craftsmanship, but I'd never received the tools. When I'd asked about them after the funeral, Mom had told me they'd been sold to pay for funeral expenses. The letter in my hands told a different story. The tools had been appraised at $8,000 and specifically left to me in Grandpa's will. My parents had sold my inheritance and pocketed the money, then lied to my face about why the tools were gone. This wasn't just financial manipulation anymore. This was outright theft. I sat in my kitchen holding that letter and felt something shift inside me that I'd never felt before. Not anger, not sadness, but a cold, crystalline understanding of exactly who my family really was and what they thought of me. The final days of December brought a different kind of reckoning. December 29th through 31st felt like watching a house of cards collapse in real time, and for once, I wasn't the one scrambling to hold everything together. The temperature inside my parents' house had dropped to 38 degrees by December 29th. Eleanor called me that morning, her voice tight with genuine concern. "Your mother's lips are turning blue, Sarah." I've never seen anyone try to maintain dignity while literally freezing in their own home. I could picture it clearly. Mom sitting on the living room couch, wrapped in every blanket they owned, too proud to ask for help, but too cold to function normally. Dad probably wearing his winter coat indoors, his arthritis screaming from the constant chill, but still refusing to admit they needed me. Eleanor had offered her guest room again, but they'd declined. "We're working things out as a family," Dad had told her, as if excluding me from family events, while depending on my money had been working out well for them. Jessica was having her own crisis. With Tyler gone and her parents unable to help her financially, she was facing the reality of needing actual employment for the first time in her adult life. She'd spent 3 days applying to retail jobs around Royal Oak and Livonia, only to discover that having no work history and an entitled attitude made her essentially unemployed and employable. The Target interview had been particularly humbling. The 22-year-old manager had asked basic questions about customer service experience and reliability questions Jessica couldn't answer without admitting she'd never held a real job. When asked why she'd be a good fit for the position, Jessica had apparently talked about her entrepreneurial background and content creation skills, completely missing the point of retail work. They'd rejected her application the same day. On December 30th, I did something I'd never had the courage to do before. I created a TikTok account and posted my first video. Nothing fancy, just me sitting in my warm apartment speaking directly to the camera about financial family abuse. I started with the phone call from Mom, playing the recording I'd made on December 18th. Her casual dismissal of my feelings, the way she'd uninvited me from New Year's dinner, like it was no big deal. The guilt trip about keeping things peaceful for Jessica. Then I showed my Excel spreadsheet. 4 years of payments, $11,500, total $3,200, just in 2024. I held up bank statements, utility bills, screenshots of Jessica's expensive Instagram posts. The numbers told a story that was impossible to argue with. The caption read, "When family treats you like an ATM, then cuts you off for peace. The heating bills I paid speak louder than their words." Within 6 hours, the video had 50,000 views. By the end of the day, it was approaching 500,000, with comments pouring in from people sharing their own stories of financial family abuse. The validation was overwhelming. Hundreds of women my age and older telling stories that sounded exactly like mine. "You did the right thing," one comment read. "I supported my siblings for 20 years and got nothing but criticism in return." Another said, "My family called me selfish for setting boundaries too. Now they call me when they need money, and I don't answer." The support was incredible, but what really got to me were the younger women commenting. "Thank you for showing me what boundaries look like. I needed to see this." Carmen found the video on December 31st and showed it to everyone at our New Year's Eve shift. The warehouse crew, these tough, practical people who'd been working overtime to support their own families, understood exactly what I'd been going through. They threw an impromptu party during our dinner break, complete with grocery store cake and gas station champagne. It felt more like family than any gathering I'd attended at my parents' house in years. Mike's kids came by to visit him at work, and I found myself playing the fun aunt role, naturally helping his 8-year-old daughter with a math homework problem while the adults talked shop. This is what healthy family relationships look like, I realized. People choosing to spend time together, supporting each other without keeping score, treating each other with genuine respect and affection. Meanwhile, my parents were spending New Year's Eve huddled together in Eleanor's spare room. Their house had become uninhabitable, the pipes threatening to freeze the indoor temperature, matching the weather outside. They'd finally accepted Eleanor's help, but only after their pride had nearly given them hypothermia. They watched the ball drop on Eleanor's television, bundled in borrowed blankets, knowing they were starting 2025 as refugees from their own stubbornness. No party, no family dinner, no celebration of any kind. Just the stark reality of what happened when you took the people who loved you for granted. My TikTok video hit 1 million views at 11:47 p.m. on New Year's Eve. The comments section had become a support group for adult children who'd been financially exploited by their families. People were sharing resources, legal advice, and encouragement for others trying to break free from similar situations. As midnight approached, I sat in my warm apartment with a glass of cheap champagne, watching the view count climb and reading messages from strangers who understood my story better than my own family ever had. When the countdown began, I raised my glass to the camera and recorded a short follow-up video. "Here's to 2025, I said, looking directly into the lens. The year I chose my peace over their chaos. The year I stopped setting myself on fire to keep other people warm." The fireworks outside my window looked beautiful against the snow-covered streets of Livonia. For the first time in years, I was starting a new year without the weight of other people's financial emergencies on my shoulders. I was starting it as myself, not as anyone's ATM or safety net or fallback plan. The first week of January 2025 brought consequences I hadn't expected. By January 3rd, my TikTok video had exploded to 2.3 million views, and suddenly, everyone wanted to talk to me. Local news stations, radio shows, even producers from daytime television. I'd become an accidental spokesperson for financial family abuse. Channel 7 News Detroit reached out on January 2nd, wanting to interview me about family financial exploitation. The reporter Michelle Torres specialized in consumer protection stories and had seen dozens of cases like mine. We filmed at Midwest Logistics during my lunch break, showing the contrast between my modest work environment and the lifestyle I'd been subsidizing. The story aired January 4th during evening news. Watching myself on television felt surreal, but the response was immediate. The station's phones lit up with similar stories from across Michigan. Women supporting grown children who refused to work, men talking about parents who'd gambled away grandchildren's college funds. Meanwhile, Jessica was learning what real work meant. After rejections from Target, McDonald's, and 3 other retailers, she'd finally been hired at a Southfield call center for $12 an hour. Her first actual job at 25, and the adjustment was brutal. Her supervisor explained basic concepts most people learn as teenagers. Show up on time every time, follow customer service scripts, no personal phone use during work hours. The idea that someone else controlled her schedule was completely foreign to Jessica, who'd treated her podcast like a hobby rather than a business. But something interesting was happening. After 2 weeks of 6:30, wake-up calls and 8-hour shifts, Jessica was understanding money's value differently. Her first paycheck was $380 after taxes, barely covering rent in the apartment she shared with roommates. She'd stopped posting expensive brunch photos because she couldn't afford expensive brunches anymore. Designer skincare had been replaced with drugstore basics. For the first time, she was living within actual means because she finally understood what her means were. My parents had been staying in Eleanor's guest room for over a week, sleeping on an air mattress and trying to maintain dignity while depending on neighbor charity. Eleanor had set firm boundaries. They could use her spare room but had to contribute to groceries and utilities and stop badmouthing me to anyone who would listen. Dad found part-time work at Donnelly Hardware 15 hours weekly at $11 an hour helping customers with repair projects. His first job since GM and his pride had taken a beating, but necessity won over stubbornness. Mom started organizing neighborhood childcare, earning cash payments watching toddlers, while parents worked day shifts. Under-the-table money that helped cover basic expenses without requiring her to admit she'd never held a traditional job. Uncle David had become the family financial investigator, discovering the situation was worse than I'd imagined. The $18,000 in credit card debt was just the beginning. There were also 2 personal loans Jessica had taken in 2023, using her parents as co-signers without explaining the terms. Total family debt from Jessica's ventures and lifestyle choices exceeded $25,000. Money my parents had been quietly paying minimum balances on while claiming they couldn't afford utilities without my help. David confronted Jessica about the loans during one of her days off. She'd been defensive, at first claiming debt was for legitimate business expenses, but David demanded actual business records. Receipts, inventory, sales, figures, anything proving actual businesses rather than expensive hobbies. What he found confirmed my suspicions. Jewelry supplies never turned into sellable products. Blog equipment that generated maybe $50 in ad revenue over 2 years. Fitness certifications never used to train clients. Podcast equipment for a show with 12 regular listeners, mostly family members. Jessica had been playing entrepreneur while my parents enabled her fantasy with retirement funds and credit cards. They'd protected her credit score and self-image while using me as their utility service. On January 5th, Jessica surprised everyone by writing me a LinkedIn message, professional and respectful, acknowledging her mistakes and taking full responsibility for the financial chaos. She didn't ask for forgiveness or reconciliation, just stated she understood my choices. I read the message but didn't respond. Some bridges once burned needed to stay that way for everyone's protection. But it was the first time Jessica had communicated like an adult instead of a victim. The Detroit News interview had opened unexpected doors. Midwest Logistics corporate headquarters had seen the story and been impressed by what they called my character under pressure and work ethic, despite personal challenges. On January 6th, the regional management called about a position that would change everything. The regional management position came with $75,000 a year and relocation to Chicago. I'd be overseeing logistics operations across 3 Midwest hubs, managing teams in Detroit, Cleveland, and Milwaukee. It was the kind of opportunity I'd dreamed about, but never thought I'd actually get. The phone call came from Janet Richardson, Vice President of Regional Operations, who'd seen the news coverage and been impressed by what she called my resilience under personal stress. "We want people who can make tough decisions and stick with them," she told me. "Your story shows exactly that kind of character." I accepted the position before she finished explaining the benefits package. The irony wasn't lost on me that this promotion would increase my salary by almost exactly the amount I'd been sending to my family over the years. The universe seemed to be rewarding me for finally choosing myself. January 7th brought a crisis I hadn't expected. Linda's condition had worsened from weeks of cold exposure and stress. Eleanor called me from the emergency room at St. Mary Mercy Hospital, her voice tight with worry. "Your mother collapsed this morning while helping me with laundry. The doctors say it's pneumonia, but they're concerned about her heart too. The constant stress and cold weakened her immune system more than anyone realized." I drove to the hospital not because I felt obligated, but because seeing someone suffer wasn't something I could ignore regardless of our history. Linda looked smaller than I remembered, lying in the hospital bed with oxygen tubes in her nose and monitors beeping around her. The attending physician, Dr. Martinez, pulled me aside to discuss Linda's condition and treatment options. During the conversation, she mentioned that patients sometimes developed complications from prolonged exposure to cold environments, especially elderly people with underlying health conditions. Has your mother been living in inadequate housing recently, Doctor? Martinez asked. Her symptoms are consistent with someone who's been in persistently cold conditions for several weeks. I explained the situation honestly. The heating bill history, the family dynamics, my decision to stop subsidizing their utilities. Dr. Martinez listened without judgment, nodding, like she'd heard similar stories before. Adult children aren't responsible for their parents' housing decisions, she said gently. But pneumonia at your mother's age can be serious. The treatment will require several days in the hospital, possibly longer if complications develop. The hospital bill would be substantial. Dad had lost his health insurance when he was laid off from GM, and they'd been too proud to apply for Medicaid. $12,000 for a 3-day stay, plus whatever additional treatment Linda might need. That afternoon, Dad called me from the hospital payphone, his voice broken, in a way I'd never heard before. Sarah, I know we messed up. Your mother might have permanent lung damage from this. We need help, and I don't know who else to call. His admission felt like vindication and tragedy rolled into one moment. For the first time in my adult life, Dad was acknowledging that they'd treated me unfairly, but it had taken Linda nearly dying for him to find his voice. I need family too, Dad, I told him quietly. I needed family 5 years ago when I started sacrificing my own financial security to keep your house warm. I needed family last month when you decided I was too stressful for Jessica to be around. The silence on his end stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. We took you for granted, Sarah. We treated you like you owed us something, instead of being grateful for everything you gave us. I don't know how to fix that now. Meanwhile, Jessica was having her own moment of reckoning at the call center. 3 weeks of actual employment had given her perspective she'd never had before. When her supervisor mentioned that the company offered advancement opportunities for dedicated employees, Jessica realized she was experiencing something completely foreign, the possibility of earning respect through work rather than to manipulation. Her coworkers treated her like any other new employee, neither special nor particularly important. She had to prove herself through punctuality, competence, and reliability. The metrics were objective and fair. Show up, do the job, meet your targets, get paid. It was the first honest transaction she'd ever been part of. Uncle David's investigation had reached its conclusion and the results were damning. $25,000 in debt directly attributable to Jessica's ventures, plus the $11,500 I'd contributed to utilities plus various smaller amounts other family members had provided over the years. The total financial impact of enabling Jessica's lifestyle exceeded $40,000. David presented his findings to the family like a corporate audit, complete with spreadsheets and documentation. He'd always been the practical one, the brother who'd built a successful business through careful planning and honest dealing. Seeing the numbers laid out in black and white forced everyone to confront the scope of the problem. The pattern was clear. Every time Jessica started a new venture, my parents would provide startup funding and ongoing support while I covered the practical expenses that kept them afloat. Jessica got to play entrepreneur while I subsidized the infrastructure that made her experiments possible. But David's investigation had uncovered something else, something that made my inheritance discovery look even worse. When Grandpa Mitchell died 3 years ago, his will had been very specific about the distribution of his tools. They were supposed to come to me, the grandchild who'd spent summers learning metalworking in his garage. Instead, my parents had sold the entire collection to a dealer for $3,200, far below its actual value of $8,000. They'd used the money to pay off some of Jessica's credit card debt, then told me the tools had been sold for funeral expenses. They'd stolen my inheritance to enable Jessica's lifestyle, then lied to my face about it. This wasn't just financial manipulation anymore, it was fraud. On January 10th, I made a decision that would change everything. I called Patricia Williams at Legal Aid and told her about the inheritance theft. She listened carefully, taking notes, then asked me to bring every piece of documentation I could find. Time to stop being the victim in this story, she said. You have legal remedies available, and it sounds like you're finally ready to use them. Patricia Williams took my case with the focused intensity of someone who'd seen too many families destroy themselves over money. January 11th through 15th felt like finally having an advocate who understood that documentation mattered more than family loyalty. We spent hours going through every piece of evidence I'd collected. Bank statements, utility bills, the estate letter about Grandpa's tools, screenshots of Jessica's social media posts, even the recorded phone calls I'd made. Patricia organized everything into a clear timeline that showed years of financial manipulation disguised as family support. The inheritance theft was the clearest violation. Michigan probate law was specific about beneficiary rights, and my parents had no legal authority to sell property that had been specifically willed to me. The fact that they'd used the money to pay Jessica's debts made it even worse from a legal standpoint. We can file for recovery of the full appraised value plus interest, Patricia explained. $8,000 plus 18% annual interest from the date of sale. They'll have 90 days to pay or face potential criminal charges for theft of estate property. Meanwhile, Jessica was going through her own transformation at the call center. 1 month of actual employment had taught her lessons that 25 years of family enabling had failed to provide. Her supervisor, Maria Santos, was a no-nonsense woman who treated all employees fairly but expected results. Jessica told me later during one of our carefully professional LinkedIn exchanges that Maria had become an unexpected mentor. When Jessica complained about difficult customers, Maria didn't offer sympathy. Instead, she taught Jessica de-escalation techniques and reminded her that customer service was about solving problems, not managing her own emotions. For the first time in her life, Jessica was receiving feedback based on performance rather than personality. Her calls were monitored for quality, her punctuality was tracked, and her monthly reviews were based on objective metrics. The accountability was foreign but strangely liberating. "I'm learning what it means to actually earn something," she wrote in one of her messages. "I never understood the difference between being given things and earning them until I started getting paychecks that reflected my actual work." Dad had been making his own adjustments to reality. Working at Donnelly Hardware meant dealing with customers who expected competence and reliability. His mechanical knowledge was valuable, but only if he showed up consistently and treated people with respect. The hardware store customers didn't care about his pride or his past employment at GM. They cared about whether he could help them fix their problems. The work was humbling but honest. Dad earned $11 an hour, helping people repair faucets, install lighting fixtures, and choose the right tools for home improvement projects. It was the first time in years he'd been valued for his skills rather than his ability to provide financial support to family members. Mom's recovery from pneumonia was slow but steady. The hospital bills had forced her to apply for Medicaid, swallowing her pride and admitting that they qualified as low income. The social worker who helped with the application asked pointed questions about their housing situation and family support system. Eleanor had been honest with the social worker about the circumstances that led to Linda's illness. The prolonged cold exposure, the family financial dynamics, my decision to stop paying utility bills. The social worker made notes about everything, explaining that elder neglect investigations sometimes involved complex family situations. "We're not blaming anyone," the social worker told Linda. "We're just trying to understand how to prevent similar situations in the future. Sometimes family members need help setting appropriate boundaries." On January 13th, my TikTok video hit 4 million views, and the comments section had become a support group for adult children dealing with financial family abuse. People were sharing resources, legal advice, and encouragement for others trying to break free from similar situations. The attention had attracted some negative responses too. Family members of other people in similar situations were commenting about ungrateful children and the importance of family loyalty. But the overwhelming response was supportive, with thousands of people thanking me for speaking up about something they'd experienced but never named. A producer from Channel 7 called about doing a follow-up story on legal remedies for financial family abuse. They wanted to interview Patricia Williams about inheritance theft, and explore how adult children could protect themselves from exploitative relatives. The regional management position at Midwest Logistics was scheduled to start February, first giving me 2 weeks to wrap up my current responsibilities and prepare for the move to Chicago. Carmen was planning a farewell gathering for the weekend before I left, and the whole warehouse crew had been talking about it for days. "You're not just leaving a job," Carmen told me during one of our final morning coffee conversations. "You're showing everyone here what's possible when you stop accepting less than you deserve." Half the people in this building have family members who take advantage of them financially. Seeing you break free gives them permission to consider doing the same thing. On January 15th, I received the legal papers Patricia had prepared for my parents, a formal demand for restitution of the inheritance theft, with a 90-day deadline for payment. $8,000 plus, accumulated interest totaling $9,400. I also received something unexpected that same day. A call from the pawn dealer who'd originally bought Grandpa's tools. He'd seen the news coverage about my situation and wanted to help track down the current owners of the collection. Several pieces had been sold to private collectors who might be willing to negotiate reasonable prices. "It's about more than money," the dealer told me. "Those tools represented your grandfather's legacy, and what your parents did wasn't right. I'll help you recover as many pieces as possible." That evening, I sat in my apartment with the legal papers spread across my kitchen table. After 32 years of being the family's financial safety net, I was finally holding them accountable for treating me like one. The documents felt heavier than their actual weight, like they contained all the boundaries I should have set years earlier. The legal papers were served on January 16th, delivered to Eleanor's house, where my parents were still staying. Eleanor called that afternoon, her voice mixing concern with vindication. "They're pretty shaken up, Sarah. Your father went completely white reading the documents. I think this is the first time they've faced actual consequences for their choices." The demand letter was straightforward. $9,400 for the theft of my inheritance, payable within 90 days, or face criminal charges. Patricia had included copies of Grandpa's will, the estate appraisal, and documentation showing the money had paid Jessica's debts instead of funeral expenses. My TikTok follow-up video about legal action went viral immediately. 4.7 million views in 24 hours, with inheritance justice trending across platforms. The comments filled with people sharing stories of family members stealing inheritances, selling belongings without permission, and manipulating estate distributions. The support was overwhelming, but what struck me were messages from older viewers who wished they'd had courage to take legal action decades earlier. Women in their 60s and 70s writing about brothers who'd stolen family land, siblings who'd emptied parents' accounts, children who'd sold heirlooms without permission. "Your story gave me strength to finally confront my son about money he took from my husband's life insurance," one woman commented. "I'm 72 and thought it was too late. But you showed me it's never too late to demand what's rightfully yours." Jessica reached out through LinkedIn again after 6 weeks at her call center job. This message was different from her previous professional communications. She'd learned about the legal action and seemed to truly understand the financial damage she'd caused. "I know I have no right to ask anything from you," she wrote, "but I want you to know I'm committed to making things right. I've been working with a financial counselor, and I have a plan to pay back the money I cost our parents. It will take years, but I'm going to do it." The regional management position exceeded my expectations. The Chicago office overlooked Lake Michigan with floor-to-ceiling windows and modern conference rooms. My new boss, Janet Richardson, introduced me with genuine enthusiasm to teams who respected my ground-up operations experience. $75,000 annually plus benefits, company car, and relocation assistance. More money than I'd ever imagined earning, certainly more than I'd been able to keep while supporting family irresponsibility. The pawn dealer's investigation had succeeded. Several pieces from Grandpa's tool collection were tracked to collectors in Michigan and Ohio. Most were willing to sell back at reasonable prices after learning the story. Frank Kowalski, the dealer, had become personally invested in reuniting me with my grandfather's legacy. Your grandfather was a master machinist. These precision instruments were his trade, and he wanted them passed to someone who'd appreciate their value. What your parents did was theft, plain and simple. On January 20th, my parents' attorney contacted Patricia about settlement. They wanted to negotiate the restitution amount and avoid criminal charges, but Patricia held firm. Full payment of assessed value, plus interest or face prosecution for estate property theft. The attorney argued the tools were sold for legitimate funeral expenses, but Patricia had documentation proving otherwise. Funeral costs were minimal, covered by Grandpa's life insurance. The tool money went directly to Jessica's credit cards. There's no ambiguity here, Patricia told their lawyer during a conference call. The will was specific, the beneficiary was clear, and fund misappropriation is documented. Your clients can pay restitution or explain their actions to a criminal court judge. Jessica's 2-month performance review showed significant improvement in attitude, punctuality, and customer service skills. She was finally understanding what professional development meant, taking evening classes at Oakland Community College toward business administration, not for another scheme but to understand financial management. On January 22nd, I received the first payment, $9,400 transferred to my account as restitution for stolen inheritance. The money felt heavier than its value, representing acknowledgement that what they'd done was wrong. I used settlement money to recover 3 pieces from Grandpa's collection, including his precision micrometer set and custom wrenches he'd made during his Ford apprenticeship. Holding those tools again connected me to something larger than family drama and financial manipulation. These tools were built for precision work and careful measurement, representing everything Grandpa valued: accuracy, reliability, and patience to do things correctly the first time. My final weeks in Livonia felt like closing a chapter I'd been trying to finish for years. January 23rd through 31st passed in a blur of packing boxes, farewell gatherings, and the strange satisfaction of watching people finally understand what I'd been going through. Carmen organized the warehouse farewell party for Saturday, January 25th. The break room was decorated with streamers from the dollar store and a sheet cake that read "Good Luck, Sarah" in bright blue frosting. Mike brought his kids, and half the evening shift showed up even though it was their day off. "You're not just leaving a job," Carmen told the group during her impromptu speech. "You're showing everyone here what's possible when you stop accepting less than you deserve. Half the people in this building have family members who take advantage of them. Seeing Sarah break free gives them permission to do the same." The response surprised me. 3 different coworkers pulled me aside during the party to talk about their own situations. Maria from shipping had been supporting her gambling-addicted brother for 6 years. Tony from receiving was paying his ex-wife's credit card bills because she threatened to move their kids out of state. Jennifer from dispatch had been covering her adult son's rent while he pursued his dream of becoming a YouTube influencer. They all had the same look in their eyes, the same exhaustion I recognized from my own mirror. The weight of being responsible for other people's poor choices while neglecting their own needs and futures. I gave each of them Patricia Williams' business card. Legal aid might not be able to help everyone, but at least they'd know their options and rights. Sometimes that knowledge alone was enough to shift the power dynamic in dysfunctional family relationships. Meanwhile, Jessica was making steady progress at both her job and her community college classes. She'd been promoted to a senior customer service representative position, which came with a $50 hourly raise and additional responsibilities. More importantly, she was learning to navigate workplace politics and professional relationships. Her evening business classes were teaching her concepts she'd never understood during her various entrepreneurial ventures. Cash flow, profit margins, market research, customer acquisition costs. All the boring fundamentals she'd ignored while focusing on the glamorous aspects of being her own boss. "I think I understand now why all my businesses failed," she wrote in one of her LinkedIn messages. "I was playing entrepreneur instead of actually learning how to run a business. I treated it like a hobby that should make money, instead of work that required skills and discipline." Eleanor had become an unexpected source of neighborhood wisdom about family dynamics. She'd started an informal support group that met at the community center every Thursday evening, focused on adult children dealing with financially manipulative relatives. The group had grown from Eleanor's original concern about my parents to include 12 other families facing similar situations. Adult children paying their parents' bills while being criticized for not doing enough. Parents who enabled one child's irresponsibility while exploiting another's generosity. Siblings who inherited family wealth while others inherited family debt. Your story opened a conversation this neighborhood needed to have, Eleanor told me when I stopped by to thank her for everything she'd done. People were suffering in silence because they thought these problems were shameful family secrets. Now they realize it's a pattern that affects lots of families. My parents had moved into a small apartment in Westland, a subsidized housing unit they qualified for based on their limited income. The adjustment was difficult for people who'd owned their home for 30 years, but it was warm, safe, and affordable within their actual means. Dad was working 25 hours a week at the hardware store, earning enough to contribute meaningfully to their household expenses. Mom had expanded her childcare services and was earning steady income watching neighborhood kids while their parents worked. For the first time in years, they were living within their means instead of depending on family bailouts. They'd made the final restitution payment on January 28th, closing the legal case and officially acknowledging their theft of my inheritance. Patricia Williams had been satisfied with their compliance and dropped any consideration of criminal charges. The transaction felt symbolic as much as financial. They'd finally faced consequences for treating me like their personal ATM, and I'd finally stopped enabling their irresponsible choices. The relationship couldn't be repaired, but at least it had been clarified. On January 30th, I packed my car with the last of my belongings and drove through Livonia one final time. Past the warehouse where I'd worked for 8 years, past Eleanor's house, where she waved from her front window, past the apartment building, where I'd learned to choose myself over family chaos. My parents' old house on Elmwood Drive looked smaller than I remembered, with a "for rent" sign in the front yard. New tenants would move in soon, people who'd hopefully appreciate having reliable heating and wouldn't take basic utilities for granted. The Chicago apartment was everything I'd hoped for. Hardwood floors, granite countertops, a view of Lake Michigan from the living room windows. But the best part was the silence. No emergency phone calls, no guilt trips about family obligations, no one expecting me to solve their problems while ignoring my own needs. I spent my first evening in Chicago, sitting on the floor of my empty apartment, eating Chinese takeout, and watching the sunset reflect off the lake. My phone buzzed occasionally with messages from coworkers in Livonia, but for the first time in years, none of them were emergencies requiring immediate financial assistance. The regional management position started February 1st, and I was ready. Ready to lead teams, make strategic decisions, and build the kind of career I'd only dreamed about while supporting other people's dreams with my paychecks. Most importantly, I was ready to discover who I could become when I wasn't constantly giving away pieces of myself to keep other people comfortable. 6 months later, I was walking along the lakefront in Chicago on a warm March evening, watching the sunset paint Lake Michigan in shades of gold and pink. The city had become home in ways I hadn't expected, filled with colleagues who respected my work and friends who valued my company without expecting financial contributions. My regional management role was thriving. I was overseeing logistics operations across 3 states, solving complex shipping challenges and mentoring younger employees who reminded me of myself at their age. The difference was that I could offer them guidance about setting professional boundaries and recognizing their worth, lessons I'd learned the hard way. Jessica had completed her first semester at Oakland Community College with a 3.7 GPA, working full-time at the call center while taking evening classes. She'd been promoted twice and was now training new customer service representatives. Her LinkedIn messages had evolved from apologies to professional updates about her progress and goals. I got accepted into the management trainee program at work, she wrote in her latest message. It's a 2-year commitment, but they'll pay for me to finish my business degree. I wanted to thank you for showing me what real accountability looks like, even when it was painful to learn. I still didn't respond to her personal messages, but I'd started acknowledging her professional achievements with brief congratulations. Trust would take time to rebuild if it ever could be, but I respected the genuine effort she was making to change her life. My parents had found their equilibrium in the Westland apartment. Dad was now assistant manager at the hardware store, using his mechanical knowledge to help customers with complex repair projects. Mom had started a small licensed daycare in their apartment complex, earning steady income while doing work she genuinely enjoyed. They'd never directly apologized for the years of financial manipulation, but their actions showed a different kind of accountability. They were living within their means, contributing to their community, and had stopped expecting anyone else to solve their problems. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was resolution. Eleanor's support group had grown to 23 families and had received official recognition from the city as a community resource for financial family abuse education. She'd invited me to speak at one of their meetings via video call, sharing my story with people who were still in the early stages of setting boundaries with manipulative relatives. The pawn dealer had helped me recover 7 pieces from Grandpa's tool collection, including his most prized precision instruments. I'd set up a small workshop in my Chicago apartment, using the tools to restore vintage furniture and learning metalworking techniques Grandpa had tried to teach me during those childhood summers. Working with those tools connected me to something lasting and meaningful, the patience and precision that had built the industrial Midwest. Every time I used his micrometer or adjusted his custom wrenches, I felt his presence and approval in ways I'd never experienced from my living family members. The most unexpected development came in February when I discovered my parents had listed me as an authorized user on several credit accounts without my permission, affecting my credit score for years. Instead of anger, I felt relief at having concrete documentation of their financial abuse patterns. Patricia Williams helped me dispute the unauthorized accounts and worked with other legal aid attorneys to develop educational resources about financial family abuse. My case had become part of a broader effort to help adult children recognize and escape exploitative family relationships. In March, Carmen visited me in Chicago with her teenage daughter who was applying to colleges. We spent the weekend exploring the city, and Carmen marveled at the life I'd built for myself in just 2 months. "You look different," she told me as we sat in my apartment overlooking the lake. "Not just happier, but more solid. Like you finally know who you are when you're not trying to be everything to everyone else." She was right. For 32 years I'd defined myself by my usefulness to other people. The responsible daughter, the reliable sister, the family safety net who kept everyone else comfortable while neglecting my own needs and dreams. Now I was discovering who Sarah Mitchell really was when she wasn't being used as an emotional and financial resource. I was someone who enjoyed challenging work-quiet evenings, reading by the lake, weekend trips to art museums, and conversations with friends who saw me as a whole person rather than a solution to their problems. My TikTok account had grown to over 1 million followers, mostly women sharing their own stories of family financial abuse and boundary setting. I posted occasionally about my progress, my work, and the ongoing recovery of Grandpa's tools, but the content had evolved from revenge story to empowerment narrative. The comments section had become a supportive community where people shared resources, celebrated boundaries, and encouraged each other to choose their own well-being over family manipulation. It had grown beyond my personal story into something larger and more meaningful. Looking back on that December phone call that started everything, I realized my mother had been right about one thing. They did want a peaceful start to 2025, and that's exactly what they got, just not the way they'd planned. They wanted peace without accountability, comfort without consequences, family loyalty without reciprocal respect. What they got was the peace that comes from finally facing reality and learning to solve their own problems. What I got was something I'd never experienced before, the peace that comes from choosing yourself without apology, the comfort of living within your own means and values, and the deep satisfaction of building a life based on mutual respect rather than one-sided sacrifice. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is let them face the consequences of their choices. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is choose your peace over their chaos. What would you have done in my situation? Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and your own well-being? Share your story in the comments, and remember that you have the right to say no, even to family. Follow for more real stories about finding your voice and keeping your boundaries, because your peace matters too.